Many people today have high cholesterol, and when we go to the doctor, they see that we have high cholesterol. Some are fortunately starting to give lifestyle recommendations, but regardless of that, they logically want to lower that cholesterol because high cholesterol is bad. And why is it bad? Because they quickly give me a statin to lower my cholesterol without considering anything else. I want us to understand that cholesterol is not bad. It is not bad. It is good because many hormones come from cholesterol. For example, the other day I had a patient whose cholesterol had been lowered so much because he had been prescribed statins and he started exercising, dieting with me, and taking care of himself, so he ended up with extremely low cholesterol. Well, he was feeling tired, he was a businessman, and at work, he didn't care about anything. He lacked that drive and wasn't feeling well emotionally. He was feeling very low and said, "I am not like this. I have never been like this." Of course, we did a hormone analysis and his testosterone levels were through the floor because they had lowered his cholesterol, since testosterone comes from cholesterol. So, it is not good to lower cholesterol so much, which is what they are insisting on these days. But why do we insist? Let's understand why cholesterol adheres to the atherosclerotic plaque, which is the problem that causes a narrowing of the artery and can logically lead to a stroke or a heart attack, because there is no blood flow as the atherosclerotic plaque begins to become inflamed. When the atherosclerotic plaque and the endothelium of the artery become inflamed, it creates, let's say, a small wound, an injury, and we need to repair that. The immune system starts to repair, and what we see there is a plaque. And cholesterol adheres to that plaque to facilitate the repair. Furthermore, when we talk about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, which is not actually bad, is the cholesterol that has a very small molecular density, which is LDL, and it is the one that adheres most easily to the atherosclerotic plaque. So the problem with cholesterol is not a problem of high cholesterol, it is a problem of inflammation. If there is no inflammation, cholesterol flows freely through the artery, and there is no issue. Therefore, we can afford to have slightly higher cholesterol. And it will be fundamental for many, as I have said, for many metabolic pathways that we need. So, to understand that in the end, the problem is inflammation and lifestyle. Now, some cardiologists are starting to conduct a cardiovascular risk assessment. So they tell the patient, you have a sedentary lifestyle, what is your weight? Obesity, abdominal circumference. Okay? He smokes, has a very high risk, statin, has a very low risk because he exercises a lot, and his cholesterol is genetic. Well, you can afford a cholesterol level of 230. It's fine because you have no cardiovascular risk, okay? But the important thing is this. For patients with high cholesterol, for example, I give them omega-3. I don't give omega-3 to lower their cholesterol because omega-3 does not lower cholesterol. Omega-3 reduces inflammation, which is what we are going to address. And of course, we need to lower cholesterol, but through lifestyle changes, right? Statins should be prescribed. But the latest is metabolic syndrome. Nowadays, we no longer talk as much about obesity, but rather about metabolic syndrome. Why? Because excess fat in the body causes metabolic disturbances. It is a whole syndrome. So when there is metabolic syndrome, there is what we just discussed, atherosclerosis, which is inflammation, and there is lipoinflammation. The adipocyte, or fat cell, is not merely an energy reserve as was believed a few years ago. When the adipocyte has a lot of fat, it undergoes hypertrophy and generates local inflammation. Due to hypertrophy, there is hypoxia in that tissue, and it begins to fill with macrophages, leading to significant inflammation. This is a metabolically very active tissue that produces many cytokines. So we are inflamed not only because there is excess volume, but because there is a permanent inflammation that produces metabolic changes. And that inflammation can ultimately lead to insulin resistance and diabetes. Why? Because our body logically does not want so much energy, so it generates insulin resistance. I am not going to talk about this. I have time, but insulin is the key that allows the sugar in the blood, the one we consume, to enter the cell, thus removing it from the blood so that the cells have the sugar they need. When we have too much sugar and a lot of energy, the body no longer wants more energy and then develops insulin resistance. But insulin is closely related to inflammation. So in the end, when there is inflammation, the body generates that resistance because insulin spikes also cause inflammation. In other words, everything is connected. And today it is also known, which is very interesting, that obesity is associated with alterations in the microflora, I am going to talk a lot today about the intestine because the intestine is practically the foundation of health. It is closely related to all our control systems. There is a very nice study in which a gut microbiota transplant was performed. The microbiota refers to the bacteria that live in our intestines. We have more bacteria than cells in our body. We have a vast number of bacteria, and the microbiome, which consists of the genes of these bacteria, is much larger, 300 times larger than our own genes. This means that our bacteria really have a significant influence, and that's why today we are going to talk a lot about them. Well, in this study, what was done was a transplant of flora in mice, and then 2 apparently identical mice were transplanted with flora from an obese person. The mouse became obese. With the same diet, with the same intake, everything. And then they would perform a transplant of flora from a thin person, and the mouse would become thin. It is now understood that an imbalance between firmicutes and bacteroidetes, which are microorganisms that live in our intestines, can produce metabolic changes that lead to obesity or prevent weight gain despite the same intake. This is very interesting. I am clear that if a person comes to me with dysbiosis, if they come to the consultation with the floral imbalance, which can be measured in stool studies, I am not going to make them lose weight until that is regulated and treated. It is going to cost me a fortune. And sometimes diets fail, not because the poor person is not doing things right, but because their gut flora is not allowing them to lose weight. This is very important. Neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are also related to inflammation. The brain also becomes inflamed. So we know that even today, this constant inflammation can be caused by toxic agents, for example, mercury, the mercury found in fish, particularly large blue fish, which are now often talked about avoiding, such as tuna and swordfish. Unfortunately, these are very good fish because they contain omega-3, but they are highly contaminated because they accumulate mercury throughout their lives, as mercury accumulates in fat. We must understand that the brain is pure fat. Pure fat? Mercury is neurotoxic, can cross the blood-brain barrier, settles in our long brain, and then produces inflammation. Viruses also, stress, which we will talk about now, also produce inflammation. And some strategies, such as taking omega-3, not only help reduce inflammation in other parts of the body, but also help reduce inflammation in the brain. So let us know that neurodegenerative diseases also have an inflammatory basis. Below, I will list the studies that discuss this. There are many. I have looked for some references, and since this will be posted later, there are people who like to go to the references and do a little more research. Because we found all these studies on PubMed, which are on Google, and we can easily find. Well, it is also known that the brain is closely related to the gut, and this is very interesting. It has been observed that in people with Parkinson's disease, the so-called Lewy bodies, which are altered protein structures that exist in a pathological state and appear in the brain, also appear in the intestine because there are neurons in the intestine as well. There is a hypothesis, the Bra hypothesis, which is also well studied, that posits that the proteins located in these Lewy bodies can travel from our intestine when the intestine is permeable. When the intestine is permeable, many toxins and proteins enter our body through the vagus nerve. These are hypotheses, but they are being studied more and more, which is why we are now talking about the second brain, the neuronal capacity of our intestines. This is not only because we produce neurotransmitters in the intestines, but also because there is a very close relationship between our brain and our intestines. And autoimmune diseases, as I mentioned, are also inflammatory, yeah? Of course, I think we are clear on that because what is acting here is the immune system attacking our own body. Many times they have a viral basis, meaning there is some virus in our body that may be overstimulating the immune system, ultimately leading to the production of that autoimmunity. The entry of toxins and pathogens into the body can ultimately be related to autoimmunity. When we have an intestine, as I mentioned before, that is not in good condition, many toxins enter the body, some of which, like mercury, remain in the organism. Ultimately, the body, being overstimulated all day, can lead to an autoimmune problem. Nutritionally, vitamin D is essential. Vitamin D is a nutrient, but above all, we acquire or produce it from contact with the sun through the skin. Now it is seen that many people have very low levels of vitamin D. We are not quite sure if it is due to the sunscreen we use or changes in radiation, but vitamin D is essential not only for keeping our bones strong, but also because it is immunomodulatory. So in almost all autoimmune diseases, vitamin D tends to be very low. Vitamin D, moreover, it is also good to know that in order for it to become an active vitamin, it must be metabolized in the liver and the kidneys. So we also need to take care of our liver and our kidneys. All of this is what I will talk about later, so I want us to connect it, as it was my idea to give this introduction, since they are also fundamental. Therefore, it is very related to nutrition, which will help us and to our intestine. And the premenstrual syndrome? Here I see that there are men and women alike, but we all know premenstrual syndrome very well. That syndrome we women experience before our period comes, with pain, fatigue, and irritability. Premenstrual syndrome can be very diverse, but it is curious because when you analyze the hormones of two women, one who has it and another who does not, the hormones are the same. We always talk about it. It's not the hormonal change. The change between progesterone and estrogens, we all have that. And if we didn't, we wouldn't get our period. In other words, it is not a hormonal problem for a person to have premenstrual syndrome. Well, it could be hormonal, okay? But normally, it is not hormonal. When gynecologists conduct a study and see that logically the hormones are normal, then there are other alterations. For example, let's go back to the intestine. I will talk a lot about the intestine, specifically about alterations in the flora. There is a type of bacteria that we have in our microbiota called Clostridium, which can be in overgrowth. Sometimes there are alterations in our bacterial colonies, and we can have an excess of Clostridium. Well, this bacteria increases the presence of an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, which releases estrogens. It releases estrogens that are then reabsorbed at the intestinal level. This leads to hyperestrogenism, resulting in higher levels of estrogens than normal due to an intestinal alteration. Notice that when we improve the intestine and address dysbiosis, premenstrual syndrome disappears because that hyperestrogenism is regulated. There are more factors that can influence, for example, hormonal changes caused by endocrine disruptors. Endocrine disruptors are toxic, and some pesticides are typically among them. Bisphenol, specifically bisphenol A, is a substance found in plastics. This includes the plastics used in the food we consume and the plastics of certain bottles. So we know that it is a substance that causes alterations in the metabolism of estrogens because it interacts with the estrogen receptor. Another thing to consider in our diet is to avoid consuming so many plastics or foods with plastics, as it is not only good for our health but also beneficial for the environment, of course. And then there is the inflammatory theory. When there is premenstrual syndrome, the uterus is usually inflamed, and many times it is also due to viral causes. HPV, for example, although we know it can cause cancer, there are many types of HPV, and not all of them are carcinogenic. However, it does produce inflammation in the uterus. Or fungi, for example, typical candidiasis causes the uterus to be inflamed. Vaginal candidiasis, which you are probably familiar with, is an overgrowth of fungi in the vagina, usually originating from the intestine. A person who has recurrent candidiasis and for whom using antifungal treatment vaginally is ineffective, and who keeps experiencing it again and again. This imbalance also comes from our microbiota, or a bacterial cause, a bacterial infection. So let us know that in the end, premenstrual syndrome is also closely related to inflammation.